The studio lights blazed with an intensity that could make even seasoned performers squint. But James Brown sat perfectly composed on the burgundy sofa, one leg crossed over the other, with an elegance that spoke of decades in the spotlight. The year was 1988, and the talk show Evening Conversations with Richard Sterling was one of the most watched programs in American television, broadcast live from a studio in Midtown Manhattan. The set was designed with that particular late 80s aesthetic, geometric patterns in pastel colors adorning the backdrop, a glossy desk separating the host from his guests, and that sofa positioned at a careful angle to capture both participants in the same camera frame. Richard Sterling, a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, leaned back in his leather chair with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His smile was practiced, the kind that looked warm on camera but never quite reached his eyes. He had built his career on a particular brand of humor, quick-witted, sometimes cutting, always walking that fine line between clever and cruel. His audience loved it, or at least the ratings suggested they did. James Brown, on the other hand, needed no introduction to anyone watching. At 55 years old, he was already a living legend, the godfather of soul, a man whose music had shaped the sound of America and whose influence stretched far beyond the entertainment industry. He had grown up in poverty in South Carolina, had faced challenges that would have broken lesser individuals, and had risen to become one of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century. He wore a sharp suit that evening, deep purple with subtle pinstripes, and his hair was styled in his signature processed waves. His presence filled the studio in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with substance. When he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive accent of the Deep South, the rhythms and pronunciations shaped by his Augusta, Georgia upbringing and the communities that had raised him. It was an accent that told a story, that carried history in every syllable, that connected him to millions of people who shared similar backgrounds and experiences. The interview had begun pleasantly enough, with Richard asking the expected questions about James's latest album, his tour schedule, his thoughts on the current music scene. James answered with the graciousness of someone who had sat through thousands of such interviews, offering insights with humor and wisdom, occasionally leaning forward for emphasis, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. The studio audience, seated in risers to the left of the set, responded warmly, applauding at appropriate moments, laughing at James's jokes. Everything was proceeding according to the script that Richard's producers had prepared. The careful outline of topics designed to fill the show's 42 minutes of actual content. But then, about 15 minutes into the conversation, something shifted. Richard had just asked a question about James's early days in the music industry, and James had responded with a story about recording his first single, his words flowing with that southern cadence that was as much a part of his identity as his music. And that was when Richard did it, when he leaned back in his chair with that practiced smile and repeated James's words back to him, but with an exaggerated, mocking imitation of his accent, drawing out vowels in a way that turned James's dignified speech into something that sounded cartoonish and diminished. The studio audience fell silent immediately, the kind of silence that is louder than any noise, the kind that happens when a room full of people collectively realizes that a line has been crossed. The cameras continued rolling because this was live television and there was no pause button, no chance to go back and undo what had just happened. The crew members standing in the shadows beyond the lights exchanged glances, uncertain how to react. Richard's smile remained fixed on his face, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a recognition that he had miscalculated, or perhaps just the adrenaline of a risk taken on live television. He seemed to be waiting for the audience to laugh, to validate his choice, to turn this moment into just another example of his edgy humor. But the laughter did not come. Instead, the silence stretched out, filling the studio like a physical presence, while James Brown sat perfectly still on that burgundy sofa, his expression unreadable, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The moment seemed to extend far beyond its actual duration, time stretching in that peculiar way it does when something significant is about to happen. Every person in that studio, from the camera operators to the makeup artists waiting in the wings, from the producers in the control room to the audience members in their seats, understood that they were witnessing something important, though no one yet knew exactly what form it would take. James did not explode with anger, did not raise his voice, did not storm off the set. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on Richard with an intensity that suggested he was measuring not just the man before him, but the moment itself, calculating his response with the same precision he brought to every performance, every recording, every important decision in his life. James Brown allowed the silence to continue for exactly 3 more seconds, a calculated pause that demonstrated a mastery of timing that only decades of performing could teach. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and carried a weight that made everyone in the studio lean forward unconsciously. "Mr. Sterling," he began, and the formality of the address was itself a statement, a subtle correction to the casual disrespect that had just occurred. "I appreciate you having me on your show tonight, I really do, but I need to address something that just happened here, because I think it's important not just for me but for everyone watching at home right now." Richard's smile faltered slightly, and he shifted in his chair, perhaps beginning to realize that this was not going to be the easy moment of entertainment he had anticipated. James continued, his hands still resting calmly on his knees, his posture unchanged, but his words carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak his truth. "The way I talk, the accent you just imitated, that's not something I'm ashamed of. That's the sound of where I come from, the sound of my mama's voice, the sound of my community, the sound of millions of people across this country who built their lives with their hands and their hearts." The studio remained absolutely silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. Not the shocked quiet of discomfort, but the focused attention of people recognizing that they were witnessing something genuine and important. James's voice grew slightly stronger, not louder but more resonant as he continued. "I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, in neighborhoods where people worked hard every single day just to survive. I shined shoes on the street corners when I was 6 years old. I picked cotton. I did whatever I had to do to help my family eat. And the people around me, they talked like I talk, and they were some of the most intelligent, creative, hard-working, loving people you could ever meet. When you mock the way I speak, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking them. You're mocking their struggles, their dignity, their worth as human beings." Richard opened his mouth as if to respond, but James raised one hand slightly, a gentle gesture that nonetheless commanded attention. "Now, I've been blessed in my life. I've traveled all over this world. I've performed for presidents and kings. I've sold millions of records, but I never forgot where I came from, and I never tried to hide it or be ashamed of it. This accent, this way of speaking, it's carried me through everything I've accomplished." James shifted slightly on the sofa, and the movement seemed to release some of the tension in the studio, though everyone remained riveted to his words. "You know what's interesting, Mr. Sterling? People will praise the way someone from England speaks. They'll call it sophisticated and charming. People will admire a French accent, call it romantic. But when someone speaks with a Southern accent, especially a black person from the South, suddenly it's something to laugh at, something to imitate for a joke." He paused, letting that observation settle over the audience. "That tells you something about what we value in this country, doesn't it? It tells you who we respect and who we don't, who we see as educated and who we assume is not, who we treat with dignity, and who we feel comfortable mocking on national television." The audience began to respond now, not with laughter but with applause, starting slowly and then building, a recognition of the truth in his words. Richard's face had changed completely. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine discomfort and perhaps the beginning of understanding. James looked directly at him, his expression not angry but serious, the look of a teacher delivering an important lesson. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you or to make you feel bad, Mr. Sterling. I'm telling you this because I think you can learn something from this moment, and maybe everyone watching can learn something too." The camera operators had instinctively adjusted their positions during this exchange, ensuring that every moment of James's response was captured clearly. In the control room, the producers had made the split-second decision not to cut away to commercial, recognizing that this unscripted moment was more compelling than anything they could have planned. James continued, his voice taking on a slightly gentler tone. "Words have power, you see. The way we talk about people, the way we imitate them, the assumptions we make based on how they sound, all of that has real consequences in people's lives. There are kids watching this show right now who talk like I talk, who come from where I come from, and when they see someone on television making fun of that accent, what message does that send them? Does it tell them they're valued? Does it tell them they can achieve great things? Or does it tell them they need to change who they are to be accepted?" Richard finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than his usual television persona. "Mr. Brown, I apologize. I didn't think—" James nodded slowly. "That's exactly right. You didn't think. And that's something we all need to do more of. Think about the impact of our words before we say them. Think about the people we might be hurting. Think about the messages we're sending." The conversation had transformed completely from the light entertainment that had been planned into something far more substantial and meaningful. James leaned back slightly on the sofa, and some of the intensity of the moment eased, though the seriousness remained. "I've spent my entire career breaking down barriers, showing people what's possible, regardless of where you start in life. My music has always been about bringing people together, about celebrating who we are, about demanding respect and dignity for everyone. And part of that respect is accepting people as they are, not asking them to conform to some narrow idea of what's acceptable or proper." The studio audience was completely with him now, nodding along, some people visibly moved by his words. Richard sat behind his desk, looking smaller somehow, the swagger and confidence that usually defined his on-screen presence notably absent. "So I'm going to continue this interview," James said, a slight smile finally appearing on his face, "because I believe in second chances, and I believe in the possibility of growth and understanding. But I hope that this moment, this conversation we've just had, means something. I hope it makes people think differently, talk differently, treat each other differently." Richard Sterling cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the sensitive microphones clipped to his lapel, and nodded slowly. The transformation in his demeanor was visible to everyone watching. The cocky television personality had been replaced by someone genuinely humbled, someone processing a lesson in real time. "Thank you for that, Mr. Brown," he said. And this time there was no performance in his voice, just sincerity. "You're right, and I appreciate you taking the time to educate me and everyone watching instead of just walking off this set, which you would have had every right to do." James acknowledged this with a slight nod, his expression softening just enough to show that he had heard the apology and was willing to move forward. The tension in the studio, which had been thick enough to cut with a knife moments before, began to dissipate slowly like fog burning off under morning sun. The audience seemed to collectively exhale, relieved that this potentially disastrous moment had been transformed into something constructive and meaningful. The interview continued, but it was different now, more genuine, more thoughtful, stripped of the superficial banter that often characterized late-night television. Richard asked questions with real curiosity, listening to the answers with obvious attention, rather than simply waiting for his next opportunity to speak. They talked about James's journey from poverty to stardom, but now the conversation carried additional depth, an understanding of what that journey had truly meant, the obstacles that had been overcome, the dignity that had been maintained throughout. James spoke about his early performances in small clubs throughout the South, about the segregated venues where he had to enter through back doors, about the determination it took to keep pursuing his dreams when so many forces were working against him. "You develop a thick skin in this business," James said, settling more comfortably into the sofa now that the immediate crisis had passed. "But you also develop a responsibility. When you achieve success, when you get a platform like I've been blessed to have, you have to use it for something more than just entertaining people. You have to use it to open doors for others, to challenge the way things are, to make the world a little bit better than you found it." Richard leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, genuinely engaged now. "When you faced discrimination early in your career, how did you handle it? How did you keep going?" James smiled, and there was something knowing in that smile, the wisdom of someone who had lived through struggles that others could barely imagine. "You have to understand something. Discrimination, disrespect, people trying to make you feel small, that wasn't occasional for people who looked like me growing up when and where I did. That was daily life. So you learn to carry yourself with pride anyway, to demand respect through your actions, through your excellence, through refusing to accept other people's low expectations of you." He paused, his hands moving expressively as he spoke, painting pictures in the air. "My mama used to tell me, James, you can't control how people see you, but you can control who you are and how you carry yourself." That stayed with me my whole life. When club owners tried to pay me less than white performers, I negotiated harder. When radio stations wouldn't play my music, I found other ways to reach people. When critics said my style of music wouldn't last, I kept innovating, kept creating, kept proving them wrong. The studio audience listened with rapt attention, And in living rooms across America, viewers were having similar reactions. This was not the light entertainment they had tuned in for, but something far more valuable. James continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone telling a story that mattered, that needed to be heard. And here's what I learned through all of that. When you respond to disrespect with dignity, when you answer mockery with grace and truth, you don't just change that one moment, you change how people think. You plant seeds that might not grow right away, but they're there working on people's minds and hearts. He glanced at Richard with a slight smile. What happened here tonight? This could have gone a lot of different ways. I could have gotten angry, could have shouted, could have walked off. And you know what? Nobody would have blamed me. But what would that have accomplished? Another incident, another headline, another example of conflict without resolution. Richard nodded slowly, processing this. So you're saying that how you respond to disrespect is just as important as the disrespect itself? James pointed at him approvingly. Now you're getting it. See, anger is easy. Retaliation is easy. But change, real change, that takes something different. That takes patience and education, and a willingness to believe that people can learn and grow. He shifted on the sofa, crossing his legs the other way. I've seen this country change so much in my lifetime. Things that were perfectly acceptable when I was young. The open discrimination, the separate facilities, the laws that treated people differently based on the color of their skin, those things changed because people stood up and demanded better. But they did it in ways that moved hearts as well as minds. They showed the humanity in themselves and forced others to recognize it. The conversation had evolved into something resembling a masterclass, with James as the teacher and everyone else. Richard, the audience, the viewers at home, as students absorbing lessons that went far beyond entertainment. Richard asked about James's music, about how his personal experiences had influenced his artistic choices, and James's answers revealed the deep connections between his art and his life, between the rhythms of his songs and the rhythms of the communities that had shaped him. When I created funk, James explained, his eyes lighting up with the passion he felt for his craft, I was taking all the sounds I grew up with, the gospel music in church, the blues my uncles played on weekend nights, the work songs I heard in the fields, the rhythms of daily life in black communities, and I was transforming them into something new, something powerful, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Every grunt, every scream, every syncopated beat, that was a statement of identity, of presence, of refusing to be invisible. Richard seemed genuinely fascinated now, all traces of his earlier persona gone. So your music was always about more than just entertainment? James laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the studio. Mr. Sterling, for people like me, for communities like mine, music was never just entertainment. It was communication, it was resistance, it was celebration, it was survival. When you couldn't say certain things directly, you could sing them. When the world tried to break your spirit, music could lift it back up. When you needed to bring people together, a good song could do that better than any speech. He leaned forward slightly, emphasizing his point. And that's why I take my art so seriously, why I've always demanded excellence from myself and everyone who works with me. Because it matters, because it means something. Because it has the power to change lives, to open minds, to break down the very barriers we've been talking about tonight. The time indicators in the studio showed that the interview was approaching its scheduled conclusion, but nobody seemed ready for it to end. The producers in the control room had already made the decision to extend the segment, recognizing that what they were capturing was far more valuable than adhering to the usual format. Richard glanced at his notes, then pushed them aside. Mr. Brown, I want to thank you again, not just for coming on the show, but for how you handled that moment earlier. You could have destroyed me on national television, and instead you chose to teach. That's a level of grace and wisdom that I hope to learn from. James smiled warmly. The tension from earlier completely dissolved now. We all make mistakes, Mr. Sterling. What matters is what we do after we make them, whether we learn from them, whether we grow. You had a choice tonight too. You could have gotten defensive, could have tried to justify what you said, could have refused to hear what I was telling you. But you didn't do that. You listened, you acknowledged, you showed that you were willing to learn. That takes courage too. The interview concluded with a standing ovation from the studio audience, something that rarely happened on evening conversations with Richard Sterling. People rose to their feet spontaneously, their applause echoing through the space as James Brown stood from the burgundy sofa with the same grace he had maintained throughout the entire evening. Richard came around from behind his desk, extending his hand, and James took it firmly, the handshake captured by every camera in the studio. It was a moment of reconciliation, of mutual respect earned through honest dialogue rather than empty pleasantries. As the applause continued, Richard leaned in and said something privately to James, words that the microphones did not catch, but that seemed to carry weight, judging by the way James nodded and placed his other hand on Richard's shoulder briefly before releasing the handshake. The impact of that interview rippled outward far beyond the studio walls. In the days that followed, newspapers across the country ran stories about the exchange, with headlines praising James Brown's dignified response and the important conversation about respect and regional prejudice that had unfolded on live television. Television critics, who usually focused on entertainment value, wrote thoughtful pieces about the responsibility of media personalities and the power of addressing mistakes openly rather than ignoring them. Richard Sterling received mixed reactions. Some criticized him harshly for his initial mockery, while others commended him for his willingness to listen and apologize sincerely rather than becoming defensive. The show received thousands of letters from viewers, many of them sharing their own experiences with being judged or mocked for their accents, their backgrounds, their differences from mainstream expectations. For Richard Sterling, the incident became a turning point in his career and his approach to hosting. He never forgot the lesson James Brown had taught him that night, and his show gradually evolved to feature more substantive conversations and fewer cheap jokes at guests' expense. Years later, in interviews about his own career, he would always cite that evening as one of the most important moments of his professional life, the night he learned that true entertainment could coexist with genuine respect and meaningful dialogue. He kept a photograph from that show in his office. The moment of the handshake, both men looking at each other with mutual understanding, as a reminder of what he had learned. James Brown continued his remarkable career, creating music, breaking barriers, and using his platform to advocate for education, economic empowerment, and dignity for all people, regardless of their background. When asked about the Richard Sterling incident in later interviews, he always spoke about it as an example of the power of choosing education over anger, of the importance of using uncomfortable moments as opportunities for growth. That night showed people something important, he would say. It showed that you can stand up for yourself and your community without tearing others down, that you can demand respect while still offering grace, that change happens through conversation, not confrontation. The legacy of that evening lived on in countless ways, in classrooms where teachers used it as an example of dignity and effective communication, in workshops about cultural sensitivity and media responsibility, in families where parents used it to teach their children about respect and standing up for what is right. The exchange became a case study in how a potentially damaging moment could be transformed into something constructive, how honest dialogue could bridge understanding, and how responding to disrespect with wisdom rather than rage could create lasting impact.